Do you have The Witcher on your wall behind you? Yes.
Yeah, it's my husband's.
I love it. Did
He
you watch
saw
the
like
show?
a local artist post their drawings, and he saw that he's like, I gotta buy it. I'm like, okay. It was
Did you
great.
guys watch the show?
He watched it without me, and then I watched it towards the end. I was like, oh shoot, I should actually watch this. It's actually pretty good.
It's
I know
really
I like
fun.
he had to fill in everything, and I'm like, all right, I get the plot. Now I gotta watch it.
Yeah, luckily it's not like that complicated. It's just like
No.
a really fun ride. Like
Yeah. And I guess like you have to really watch it in order to understand it. Like every detail counts, and then
right.
it comes together at the end, which it should be like that.
Yeah, I just finished watching Cursed on Netflix, and it's
Ooh.
that one's like all the King Arthur myth, but like so like kind of before King Arthur.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so there's like a lot of female characters, which I really like, and it's like the writing's not that great, like everything's kind of like very splashy, ridiculous red blood, but it's so fun. And like the last episode of this season, I was just like, oh, I need to see more.
That was like the show we kind of like watched. It was like Vikings. There was like
Yes.
6 seasons.
Yeah.
And,
Ragnar, not Ragnar. The
yeah, Ragnar and
Floki. Floki is in Cursed
oh,
as Merlin. So it's very fun because you get to hang out with him some more. Love that.
I love him as an actor. He does so well, especially in that 6th season where he was like depressed because he lost the love of his life and all that. And I'm like, I'm sorry. And then when he finds out that Jesus was the ultimate God, that was like, wow, that was a slap in the face.
It's such a good show.
Uh,
There's, if you love that, do you listen to podcasts at all?
Sometimes it all depends.
There is a podcast that is Vikings.
Yeah,
Like it is all about Vikings. And it's this guy who does YouTube videos where he like talks about how realistic different things are.
Huh, interesting.
And so he did a deep dive on Vikings. And then History Channel reached out to him and was like, hey, we really liked the work you did on this. Can we like fly you out to the sets and like you can interview all the actors? So it's just like this guy who is like such a history buff nerd who's just loves talking to all of the actors, and you get to like hear about everyone. And like Lagatha, that actress is like such a cool lady in real life. Like they found her at like a jujitsu or some kind of martial art. Like she's like really top ranking in martial arts and like not really an actor. And then she was like, yeah, I'll do this. Like,
if you like kind of like that kind of like sci-fi stuff, like there's a really good show on Netflix and no one gives it justice. It's such a good show. It's called Sense8. And it's like a lot of LGBT stuff too, and like it goes through like 8 stories of like world life problems and like how men are treated, how women are treated, and like it really goes down to the foundation. I love it because it's all different stories, but it all comes together, and I love it. And it was cool because it was filmed in each of the countries, and I'm like, dang, no wonder that budget was so high.
That's amazing. I've like
watch
heard
it. It's
about
great.
it a little bit, but that sounds really cool.
It's really good.
I'll have to try it out.
Is it like it almost sounds like a less edgier version of 13 Reasons Why?
I would say it's more sci-fi because there is science to it because it's really good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, definitely watch.
You think if I showed it to my dad, who's very traditional, he might understand some parts of it?
Really good and educational too, because it kind of shows like the parent side too.
By the way, you guys realize that you are being recorded.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Good.
You guys got any other good Netflix recommendations?
If you haven't watched Kipo, then you should, because it's a really good show.
Yes, DreamWorks is a really did well.
And what is it about?
It's about this girl. It's like a post-apocalyptic. If I could talk, post-apocalyptic dialectic future, and this girl, she lives underground with her family, but she gets sent above ground, and there's like this huge mystery surrounding like Scarlemagne and like who her family is and like why the world came to how it is. I
Wait,
think
what was it called again?
Kipo.
How do you spell that?
Kipo.
Okay.
Have you guys watched Wandering Earth?
Mm-mm.
No.
You should watch it. It's similar, a little similar to Kipo. So basically, a bunch of scientists now realize that Earth in next 30 years will expand and just destroy the Earth. So what they do is shift everyone in an underground city and start to accelerate Earth from our solar system to another solar system.
Oh wow.
Wow.
So that's all. That's the whole thing, and the project is named Wandering Earth.
Nice. Sounds
Are
like some good options there.
I'm sure you guys have already watched Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's so amazing.
Bless.
Oh my gosh.
If anyone has seen like the movie on Hulu, it's called Cured. It's like about a zombie apocalypse and how they cure the people that were zombies. But the crazy thing about it is like people in society want to exclude them because they still think they're monsters, or they will like revert back to their kind of like insanity.
So,
Oh wow.
And
so even though
it's
they are
really
healed up, they are
interesting
still
too, because
monsters.
like as a zombie too, after they get cured, they still have memories of being a zombie in dreams.
Wow.
Oh.
Yeah, it's really good. It's called Cure on Hulu.
Twist on the
That-
zombie genre.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like reverse, like where you actually see them get cured and like how they have to revert back into humanity. Like they don't know how to function in humanity.
That's
Then
cool.
you should watch Project Power.
What's it called?
It's about
Project what?
Project Power. It's basically they develop some kind of capsules, and if you take it, it gives you some kind of some superpower for few minutes or few hours. For example, if someone is muscular, he will get super strength. Someone becomes a human torch, those kind of things. But there are side effects. So, for example, if someone is human torch, after 2 hours, he's still on flame.
Nice.
So there are some bad sides to it, and there are some good sides to it, and then this whole thing is all about it.
Nice. There we go. You got to keep up with our viewing options here in our quarantine. So, yeah. So before we get started, have you guys gotten a chance to all look at final project and thought about what you guys want to do for that?
I had a question about that real quick.
Yeah.
For the comp sketches, because I saw that one of the examples, someone did like a whole comic page.
Yep.
So basically 3 little drawings, you know?
Mhm.
And it said in the directions that you needed 15 comp sketches, but I'm not sure how you do that if you're doing a comic page.
Yeah, good question. So I changed that down to, I think I changed it to 7 today. I went through and edited a few things on there just to change the requirements for this quarter. So if you're doing it for a comic page, you have to do your thumbnail sketches, at least 7, but you can play around. It doesn't need to be completely 7 different page designs, but sometimes you can do, 3 versions of one panel, 2 versions of another panel, and then
Okay.
then 2 versions of the page laid out. So some of those thumbnails can just be for individual panels, and some can be for the layout of the entire page. Next class, we will talk about comic page layout. So for anyone that's interested in doing the comic page for their final project, you can start to work on that. A lot of it will be similar to like the shot selections that we talked about the first week in that first project. But just we'll go over kind of how to fit it onto a comic page and the best number of panels and how to arrange those panels in different ways, okay?
Cool. Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
So yeah, any other questions on that? If anyone's thought about?
So so there are 2 options we have. Either we make a comic page or we make a book cover, right?
Yeah, basically just a large illustration. So the one single large illustration or a comic page that has, 3 to 5 smaller illustrations on it.
Can you put the title on it, or would that not be suggested?
You can kind of plan it out with a title and kind of think about that. But designing font and font choices are kind of a whole nother discipline. So if you want to think about it as a cover, that can be a good way to think about it. And you can think about leaving negative space where you would want to put a title. But I want to see it submitted without any text on there. You can also submit it with the title on there, but I'm going to be judging it just as like the illustration. I want to see just the artwork, just the drawing.
Okay, so no text. So let's say 2 characters are talking, none of that.
Oh, if you're doing a comic page, you can include, word bubbles and captions.
Okay, because that's what I was going to do, and I wasn't sure. When you said that, I was like, wait, what?
I was thinking, yeah, just in terms of like a title on a cover image.
Okay. And
But
if
yeah.
we do bubble, we don't have to do title. Like that's okay if we don't put the title on there, right?
No, I don't think you need a title. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Any other questions on that project? Yeah, so let me check. I think next week we'll do some critiques on that project. Whatever you guys have for thumbnails of work, I think probably next Thursday. We'll kind of see how the timing goes. I'll check in with you guys on Thursday to see how it's going. So just know, yeah, we'll do critiques on that next week, and then the final will be week after that. So it's going to be coming up real quick here, flying through the quarter. Oh, just want to let you guys know, I'm going to have a small assignment, just worth 5 points again, for you guys this week. Has anyone ever done any urban sketching before? So taking your sketchbook outside, drawing buildings, streets, drawing parks, anything like that?
I think I did that in your 109 art
Yes,
class,
yeah,
and then
we
I
did.
never turned it in.
So that's if we were on campus, we would spend a day just going outside and drawing around campus. But just to let you guys know, I think I'll have it due on Friday. Let me just show you guys what I mean though. But it's just going outside and drawing anything you see. So it's the best way to kind of learn the perspective things that we've been talking about and I showed you in those videos. So I'd like you to include something that has some straight lines in it. So something that will have a little bit of linear perspective, but you can take a lot of liberties with it. And this really, drawing in your sketchbook, drawing from life, is the best way to find your own style. And there's never any shortage of things to draw out there in the real world. You can sit on your front porch and draw. You can go to a nearby park, anywhere where obviously where you can be away from people and socially distance and all that stuff, but find a place to just chill out, the weather's nice, and do some drawing. So here's are just some examples. This artist is one I really like. And it's just kind of a way to really find your own style and not worry about accurately capturing the location. You're not trying to draw it photorealistically, you're trying to capture the overall feeling of the place. So the feeling of a building, capturing story too by adding in like little storytelling details that will help people relate to it. Looking at silhouette shape, looking about adding in selective details, so not adding details everywhere, just adding details in on smaller locations. You can work on perspective, you can work on light and shadow, which we'll talk about today. And just trying out different things and trying out different compositions.
Does it have to be buildings, or can it be like, can it only have like a couple, or maybe even like it could just be like a road with like telephone poles or something?
Yeah, as long as it's something that shows a little bit of linear perspective. So yeah, road with telephone poles would do that. Even
Okay.
like a couple signs going off into the distance would do that. Just so there's depth in there.
Okay.
And it's not just all those organic kind of tree shapes, because
Yeah.
so it's nice to have that contrast where there's some organic shapes like you see here, and then some straight line shapes in there as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and I will make that discussion, I think, either later today or first thing tomorrow, and I'll message you guys when that's made. Okay, so that'll just be kind of a little bit of practice for you guys to practice some of the things we'll be talking about. All right, so today we're going to talk about light and shadow. So light and shadow is very important. So this will all directly be able to be used on your final project. And it will have just a lot of uses in your overall, in the artwork that you're making. But using light and shadow accurately in a consistent way is going to really give the objects in your composition volume. So it'll make them feel more three-dimensional, make them feel rounded, make them feel like they're taking up actual space in your composition. And there's a lot of different ways to handle light and shadow, and kind of the way you do that and the plan of action you have in a given illustration will kind of be a part of your style. So some people have very, very accurate use of light and shadow where they're really trying to replicate what they see in the real world. And other artists have a more stylized where they kind of simplify it and just break it down to the basics of light and shadow. But you can do that both through the use of color and the use of value. So we'll kind of talk about a few different approaches and kind of the foundations, but you'll kind of take some of those and then apply it to your own style and figure out how you're going to apply light and shadow in your own work. So some people I saw starting to get light and shadow added on to the previous assignment. And so that's a good start. So I'll kind of just go over some of those fundamentals and you continue to think about how you want to use it in your own art. Oh, and did everyone see the see their grades for the previous assignment?
Yeah.
Yeah, those were really good. I really liked the artwork you guys came up with. There were some really good styles that are kind of coming out. You know, really good use of color in there. And I think overall you guys can kind of continue what you were doing there and just push it a little bit further for that final art. So the final art, you'll just have to, you know, concentrate on getting a little bit, or for the final project, getting a little bit cleaner line work, working on like little drawing inconsistencies that may come up. But I think your guys' use of color is coming along really well. So that's really good. Then we'll just continue with that for the final. And just, I put comments on everyone's work there. Even if you got a really good grade on it, which most people did, I still wanted to give you just some general suggestions of kind of things you can work on as you move on to the next project. All right, back to lighting. So the biggest thing for a light source is to, or for light and shadows, to know your light source. So you want your lighting to be consistent on all objects in your illustration. So here's a very simple setup here with simple geometric shapes, and it's going to really help you to think about when you light more complicated objects like people, cars, buildings, if you can think about how you're going to light it, even if it was a simple form like a cube, a cylinder, or a sphere. So for this one, usually if I'm doing a light source, I want to indicate where it's going to be with just a little arrow outside of my composition. So I could have that light source be there. Maybe the light source is coming from behind. On those objects, maybe it's coming from up below, coming from underneath. And I like to put that, especially kind of when I'm doing those thumbnails, to really start to figure out where that light source is going to be, just so I have it in my head as I start to add shadows on these objects. And the most common light source obviously will be above, coming from above objects because of sun and lighting in the room, and usually off to one side a little bit, one or the other. And so having that consistent light source will make your lighting more believable, and it'll give consistent shadow shapes on all the objects. So if the light is coming from over here, the light's coming from all this way, all the shadows go opposite of the light. Okay, so the light will hit right here on this front plane. So then this side plane will get shadow. So same, now I have that figured out on this one object. Now I can start to apply that to all of these other objects in here. So this could become a more complicated illustration later on. I could change this into a cityscape, anything like that. But it's helpful to think about all those objects first as simple geometric shapes, apply the lighting to those, and then it will be consistent throughout your entire drawing. And again, for the most part, usually lighting from above will work for what you need, okay? If you do end up putting the lighting underneath or straight from the side, it can have some dramatic effects, but it's also a little bit more difficult to execute because we're not used to seeing those lighting conditions from below or the side as much. So that's when you may need to take reference photos, okay? So if there's any lighting things that are difficult for you to figure out, people, clothes, faces, those are going to be the things that are difficult to figure out. So that's when you would need a reference photo. But there are some consistent things we can practice to get that all figured out correctly as you work. But knowing that light source and then keeping all those shadow shapes consistent on your drawings will help. All right, has anyone ever heard of cast shadows and form shadows before?
Heard of cast shadow, but not form, or I might have heard a different word for it.
Yeah, they're sometimes called a core shadow.
Oh yeah.
Cast shadow, form shadow, core shadow. These are basically different types of shadows that you will see. The two different ones there. The main one is cast shadow and form shadow. They have different characteristics, and you have to handle these shadows differently as you draw to really get that three-dimensional effect. So the best way to see it here is just on a simple sphere. So cast shadows should be pretty simple. They're the ones that are cast usually on the ground. So let's put in our light source here. Kind of do that same kind of above and from a slight angle there. So all the light is coming down, it's going to hit the object here. So we'll have light side here and a shadow side here. So usually when I start, I want to just define the shadow shapes. Okay, so what is the shadow shape being made on this object? And for a sphere, it is very regular and consistent. There's not going to be any weird bumps on this guy. People know how this shapes fall on a sphere pretty in a regular, usual way for you to expect. So that would be the form shadow, the shadow that is on the object itself. Okay, and then the cast shadow is the one that falls on the ground. There's different ways you can handle this, and again, that will become part of your style. So this right here is just kind of called two-tone shading. It has very simple flat shadows. There's not really a difference in the way the core or the form shadow is handled in a similar way as that cast shadow. There's not really a whole difference in there. So this is, at least you should have this type of shading on your images, at least a simple two-tone shading to help show the volume and make things feel three-dimensional in your artwork. But if you want to go for a more realistic look, or if you've ever taken a drawing class where you like draw still lifes and things like that, you'll probably notice a difference in some of these shadows. So the biggest difference in here is the treatment of the edges. So a core shadow or a form shadow will have a soft edge. So that means this edge right here will softly fade out towards that light side. So that soft fading of the shadow will again help to show that volume of it. So it's hopefully really going to make this object feel a lot rounder and a lot more three-dimensional here. Has anyone ever drawn these simple shapes in like a still life drawing class before?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was having you guys do with that digital still life. So you can keep going and practice with that some more because then you're practicing with that actual medium. So now this allows us, when we shade like this, to see that highlight as well. That highlight will be right there. And that will be the brightest part, and it's also the closest point to that light source as well. So you can continue to build these shadows up, and you can get into a lot of details with these. And if you're doing this in color, it's good to practice it kind of both in black and white, and also in color as well. Eventually you'll start to see interesting little things like reflected light as well. And usually that is right about here, in this section, where light comes down, bounces off the ground, and then hits that shadow right there. And it's slightly lighter than the rest of the shadow. This area is reflected light. Oops. And usually that the cast shadow has some variation in value. So the darkest part of the cast shadow will be right here under the object. And notice now that the cast shadow has a crisp edge. So this is a hard edge right here on the cast shadow, where it very quickly changes from dark to light. So there's not a transition between dark and light right here. But here we have the dark, and it slowly transitions to the light. So that's going to be the biggest difference between those cast shadows and form shadows, is making sure your cast shadow has a very crisp edge to it. So depending on your style, you probably won't have fully rendered shadows like this. This is, if you were to do it like this, it would be for a much more kind of realistic style, but it's still good to know the characteristics of these shadows. So then you can kind of simplify them, know what you're looking at, know what you're trying to achieve, and then abstract them for your own style and your own purposes. But you will see these same types of shadows as you're illustrating a person or any sort of other object, to get that in there. So when you're drawing a person, you'll still look for those cast shadows and form shadows as you're drawing. Okay. Let's go. Let's do this guy. Okay. So I went over this briefly when we did our figure drawing day, but I'll kind of just do it again with the direct thought of lighting and shadow in mind. So again, helpful to put in that light source. Oops. on that person. And then when you see it from the profile, you can really see how these planes of a face the light. So you can see here the in and out of a person's profile. It will be similar with different face and body types, but it may be a little bit adjusted. So the forehead usually faces up, so that will get a highlight. Under the brow ridge, that faces down, so that will get a shadow. Top of the nose is highlight. Under the nose is shadow. So you can see the pattern. So it's like light, shadow, underlip, light, shadow. Top of the chin is light, underneath the chin is shadow. So that's how the light's hitting it. So as you design the shadow shapes on a character, you want to think about that light, dark pattern as you're developing that. So overall, if I thought about this as a sphere, it would be about like this. So you get that form shadow right there. You have the neck and shoulders. And that will get a cast shadow down there on the neck and shoulders. So this is basically what I want to do, but fill this in with a little bit more details because we have different bumps and ridges in a human face. So we know here now underneath those eye sockets is going to be a shadow. So this is a good thing to look at when you're designing your character. Does your character have very deep eye sockets? Are they going to have dark shadows under there or less? Men usually have deeper eye sockets, so you'll get more shadows there for men, a little bit less in women usually. So then the nose, again, that's its own form. So it's kind of like a pyramid form. So you usually get light on one side, then a cast shadow underneath the nose. A little bit under that part of the nose will get shadow, and then you'll get a cast shadow like this. So then the nose has its own form shadows and cast shadows. Cheekbones have its own form shadows underneath there. One whole ear will be in shadow. You'll get some weird little shadow shapes if the ear is in light there, with all the little forms there in the ear. The top lip is usually in shadow. And then a little shadow underneath the chin there. And then the whole head, we usually have a big cast shadow that's on the neck, sometimes on the shoulders. There you go. So that's the general kind of consistent lighting, but the way I'm thinking about it is still like that simple shape, and you can break it down for any sort of face. And any sort of face will have kind of this consistent, regular shading on it that you can kind of expect. See, sometimes you see it under that other cheekbone right there as well. And right now, I'm not really treating the edges of these shadows differently. Kind of the cast shadows and form shadows are treated the same. So then it's deciding if you do want to go in and soften up the edges of the form shadows. So I can go in and soften some of these up. And fade it out along there. But that takes a little bit more. So the top of this is part of a form shadow. That will have a soft edge. Under the eyes is a cast shadow. This part of the nose is a form shadow. But this cast shadow under the nose is a crisp cast shadow. Bottom part of this chin is a form shadow. And this big shape is a cast shadow, so I'll keep that edge crispy. So as you're drawing, you don't need to go in and always differentiate between cast and form. You can choose to do that as you're working, but you want to kind of think about that as you're starting your illustration style. So do I want to soften my core shadows. Is that part of my style, or do I like it more simplified where I don't really differentiate the difference between those and I just keep a simple flat shadow in there? When I'm doing an illustration, having good light and shadow consistencies can really add volume in there, but it also can draw your eye to the focal point. So whatever thing you want to be your focal point, that's usually where I will concentrate my shadows on there to think about it, because it will draw the vision, because it creates contrast there. And I will figure out the shadows first on my focal point and then use that to kind of figure out the shadows everywhere else. So here I'll do this guy as my focal point. And we'll just put in some flat shadows. So flat shadows, I basically refer to those as not having a difference between cast and form. So this guy here, I'm looking at this, again, kind of a complicated shape, but the head I can think of basically as like a little cube shape. The neck, just a cylinder. The torso as just a rectangle shape. And then these arms are just little cylinders as well. This is kind of how I want to think about this, even if it's drawn with more details. And that will then help me figure out where these shadows are going to go on this simple object. So usually it's good to kind of think about dividing your figure in half light, half shadow. So I can think about it, if I have the light coming from there, I can do light on this side and then dark on this side, light on the front, dark on this side, light on the top of these cylinders, dark underneath there. Okay, and now I can apply this to my same guy here. Okay, but the brim of this hat will create a cast shadow there. Cast shadow of the whole head on his neck. And once you start to get to clothes, that shadow shapes become a little bit more difficult to draw because they follow the folds of the clothing and things like that. So that might take a reference photo to practice with that. So right now, as you guys see, I'm not really showing a difference between cast shadows and form shadows. So this is just, I would call this simple, flat, two-tone shading. Okay. So now I will use this. I'm like, okay, so this shading does look good. I have kind of a light side in here. I have a shadow side in here. That means my light is coming from about this direction. Okay. Now if I move this out, and now I can apply this light source to all the other objects in here. So this is my focal point. So I want the highest contrast shadows right here on my focal point. So when I add shadows to other objects in here, I'm going to just lighten that shadow. And I can now apply shadow shapes to these other objects as well. But I have the cast shadow going away from the light source. Same with on this character here in the background. Same with this little garbage can shape here. And I was just kind of thinking of these as buildings here. So we got light side of the building, dark side of the building. Right about there. So even if I come in, we can add in something else to here. Maybe we add in like an awning on this building. You can add in a cast shadow under here. Shadow right there. Okay. So now I have consistent shading in this piece. Oh, between that needs a shadow there too. And if you have objects too in the distant background, so maybe we have some other buildings back here, you know, whatever it may be, objects in the distant background do not need shading on them. Okay, so that's another thing that will help to show depth, is you want most of your shadows in the foreground and on focal points. Okay, so don't worry too much about putting shadows on anything that's in the distant background, whether it be trees, buildings, mountains. Keep all your shadows in the foreground, and the most intense shadows, meaning the highest contrast, should be on that focal point. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Okay, now let's do it with color. So color is where it can really start to be fun with adding in those shadow shapes. So generally I like to think about a couple ways to add shadows. So you can really increase the intensity of those shadows by making them darker. And you can also make your shadows more subtle when you're adding in color, meaning you're not shifting the color that much darker, or you can make them really intense. So this is a character, Bomber Girl, who I've done a couple comics for. She's a very intense character who gets in lots of action sort of situations. So that's why it's helpful to keep my flat colors on one layer. So I'm going to call this layer flat colors. And now I'm going to have a new layer that I'm going to call shadows, or two tones shadows. So I'm going to suck up the color of her skin here. Kind of got a middle value, kind of a reddish orange hue. And I'm going to start with just not very intense shadows. I'm just going to make it a little bit darker. I'm not going to adjust the hue or the saturation as I add in these shadow shapes. So I'll keep it consistent with her hat, with her face, on the hair. Just a little bit darker. Okay. So now you guys can see these shadows on here, especially the ones on the skin here. These, I would call these more subtle shadows. So you also want these to think about coming back to your story. So you want the type of lighting you're using to match what's going on in the story. So usually for calmer moments, less intense moments, using more subtle shadows like this will work for the most part. But sometimes you can try and make those shadows a little bit more intense, and you can do that by adjusting both the value and the hue and saturation. So let's just I went back and I selected the skin on my flat colors layer. Now I'll go back up to the two-tone shadows layer, and I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation. So now I can play around with how intense these shadows are. So I can just start to make them a little bit darker there, okay? So that's just adjusting the lightness. So that already feels like a little bit more intense moment, a little bit more dramatic. I can also play with the saturation and hue of that shadow. If I turn up that saturation, it kind of gives it a little bit of a glowing effect. And I can I can turn down the saturation and it makes it feel a little bit cooler. So that feels now like a cooler shadow on there. Even though I'm not adjusting the hue, I'm just adjusting that saturation. That will make that shadow shape feel warmer or cooler. So you can bump it up like that, but that would be a very intense moment. And if you use this through an entire storyboard sequence or through an entire comic page, it would probably be too much. You want to pick and choose just one or two areas or specific areas to use this more intense coloring. So I usually like to put a little bit of saturation into my shadow shapes. I find it just creates a little bit of warmth there. You can also adjust the hue slightly as well. So you can do something weird and get some like dark green shadows in there. But you have to be careful because sometimes that can be a little bit too jarring. But I find just bumping down that lightness and messing with the saturation is kind of the best way to get some more intense or more interesting colors in your shadow shapes. Okay, and then if you want to, again, you don't need to, it'll depend on your own art. If you want to add highlights in there, you can do that as well. But I usually do that on a layer, again, its own layer, and usually underneath my shadow layer. So I'll have the shadow layer on top, then I can put the highlights underneath. And if you add in highlights, keep them very subtle. And I like to have a little bit of texture in there, so I'm going to use the same Warren Oil Pastel brush. Sometimes people will use like this airbrush. I'll show you what this looks like. But you have to turn this opacity way down when you're adding in highlights. So you can use this airbrush one, but it just kind of gives it a overly airbrush feel. And when people first started getting into comic book coloring in like the late 90s, they overused that airbrush feel on their comics. So now it's just kind of something people try and avoid in their artwork. So I'm going to use this textured brush, and you can usually use, I choose kind of a very light goldenish color usually when I do highlights. If it's in any, but if you can do it in a, this is with any sort of kind of naturalistic lighting. So outdoors, sunshine, orange light sources. The bottom lip usually gets a highlight on there. You can play around with other colors for highlights. So if you ever have like inside a lab or something like that have like some weird bright green highlights, can have a cool effect too. But again, you just don't want to do too much for those highlights and usually keep them pretty subtle. So you can see the difference. I'll turn that layer on and off. It does give it like a little bit more pop of 3-dimension, but it takes a little bit more time and you don't want to overdo it so it doesn't feel overly rendered. I usually won't do much more than this for a comic book panel. Okay, so I like to keep my shadows pretty flat and simple, and then add in just a little bit of highlights, and I'll usually just add highlights on that focal point. So usually the main character I'm drawing or the face of that character to get an idea of that. You can also, sometimes you can use solid black for those shadow shapes. So that can be a cool look too to really get that intensity. But if you do want to do that and use solid black for any sort of style like that, that should kind of be a consistent style that you use throughout your drawing. So you don't want to just like all of a sudden throw in these solid black shapes just in like one location. But it can be a really nice way. You'll see this a lot in, you know, comic books. They just use the ink for the shadow shapes as well. You can still combine this with some colored shadows as well, but it can give a cool look too. And sometimes I'll just reserve these black shadows for, again, those high intensity moments in the story, and to really make a certain scene pop. So I could do it like that, and then you can still combine this with colored shadows as well. I could still come in here and add in those colored shadows also, combined with the black. Okay. But yeah, have fun with playing with those colors for shadows, and really just looking at and observing the real world, like how we did with those still lights are the best kind of ways to practice with this, to see what happens to colors when you put, you know, the light from a sunny day versus the light from your desk lamp is going to create different color highlights, different color shadows, and different colored results as you're working. So it's good to practice with different color light sources and under different lighting conditions. So here's some images I grabbed to just show some good lighting. This is Ivan Earl. I show a lot of his art in my 109 class, if anyone was in that class. He did all the concept art for Sleeping Beauty. But and his shape, the style he uses is a very bold, solid shape. So it's easy for him to keep this consistent lighting because he simplifies a lot of his shapes here. So you can see light side, shadow side, light side, shadow side, light side, shadow side on these hills there. Here he's mixing some solid black shadows with colored shadows as well. So that's kind of an interesting choice.
I haven't seen that movie. Was the art like that?
Yes, it's a little different than this, but it was highly detailed and highly stylized as well. Is that you, Brayden?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have it, it's on Disney Plus.
Yeah.
I watched it recently. It's not the best story. The story doesn't really hold up as well.
Yeah.
But the artwork is just amazing in that.
Okay, cool. Do you think you could send those when you tell us about the little assignment too, possibly, for examples?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
These shadow ones or the urban sketching ones, or both?
You can do both.
Yeah, I'll do both. So here's just a nice one. So you can see consistent light side, shadow side, light side, shadow side on the house and on the car here. But mostly all the shadow shapes are here on the focal point. So these trees in the background, they don't have light side, shadow side on them. The gate doesn't have light side, shadow side. So think about, you can sometimes think about it like a spotlight on stage shining down on these objects to focus your attention in certain areas. Oh, so here's a nice one. Oh, before we go, so this one you can really see these cast shadows nicely. So I really like cast shadows. I think cast shadows offer a lot. So what's the difference here? So how can you tell that this ball is off the ground here versus all these three guys are standing on the ground? Well, that's using that cast shadow. So showing the cast shadow, whether it's touching an object or not, will show if that object is on or off the ground. So just very, very simply, our sphere here, sitting on the ground. When their sphere is up here, now it's floating. So that can be a very good thing to do if you want to show someone standing. You want to show that cast shadow touching their feet, or if they're jumping or running, you can show that cast shadow on the ground. So that's a really good way to show. Cast shadows will help show that objects are grounded. Some artists too will choose just to draw cast shadows. So that can be a interesting choice if you want to think about that. And also the color of these cast shadows. So usually outdoors on a sunny day, cast shadows will get a slightly blue tint to them. A blue tint because of the reflected light from the blue sky will usually make those shadows feel slightly blue. Here's another one. Again, very simple two-tone shading. So just shading right here on the character. You're not drawing the cast shadow. Here's the cast shadow on the ground. It's not being drawn differently than the form shadows, but a very simple, really nice, clean look here. But it's light side, shadow side, light side, shadow side. They're not even really making the shadow shapes go around the features of the face. And that's completely fine, and it works really well for this simple style of art. Light side, shadow side. And then again, the objects in the background don't have light side or shadow side on them. Just there on the focal point. Here the scene is more intense. They're trying to get like the energy of the nightclub going, dancing energy. So now we have a really bright highlight side, especially on the skin here, and then darker, more dramatic shadows on there. So there's a little more contrast in this one because it's a more intense image. There's a lot of movement and excitement and energy going on. This one kind of capturing the light coming in a window or in the bedroom. And this one just does a good job with color, where everything inside the room is kind of that monochromatic yellow. And then outside is more cooler colors there to kind of differentiate going between the inside and the outside. And again, more shadows here in the foreground and on the focal point, and you're not really seeing shadows there outside of the window. But again, simple, hard edge shadows everywhere. They're not softening out these shadows. They could if they wanted to, but for the most part, think simple when you're getting those shadows in there. This is a page from Watchmen. Has anyone read Watchmen by chance?
I have.
If anyone's into comics, this is like a must read story.
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So I like here, so by this panel here, the shadows get super intense. It becomes these weird kind of reddish, purplish shadows here, combined with some solid black. So this is like the most intense panel here, the highest bit of emotion. So you can see those shadows, shapes, colors all get very intense in that image.
I can see where they kind of give up realism for, you know, just even sometimes they're purple, sometimes they're blue, sometimes they're red, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. Don't be tied to what would happen in reality. You obviously want to think about that. Where's my light source? But don't be afraid to abstract it or change it for intensity and for the purpose of the story. So yeah, much more so. They just kind of have a little, orange to yellow here. There's no real shadows in this panel. There's a slight shadow here on his face, kind of green highlights and orange on this side. And then this panel, that should be the most intense there. I just pulled this image up after you guys were talking about it. This is the show, Jessica, right, that you're mentioning?
Yeah, that's Kipo.
Yeah, so cool lighting here. Again, simple two-tone lighting. And they actually have a little bit of a hard highlight in here too. So you can add in a harder highlight. I usually use a softer airbrush for that, but you can experiment with a hard highlight as well. And here I'll send you guys this image as well. This is just our Joe average face, but this is kind of where, you'll see different or the same general type of lighting that can then be applied to lots of different faces with a kind of guide like this. And I think I have an image, I'll have to find it, but where it has a number of different types of lighting kind of from different angles of the face. So I'll try and find that and send that to you guys as well. So yeah, I'll just send you guys these images. Here's another one. So this has little softer edges here on this bottom part where you can see they're softening out those form shadows. The same consistent from this whole comic page, the light's coming from this right side of the page, and it's consistent in every panel there. But it gives you the feel of that setting sun, so coming straight from the side rather than from above. Kind of helps you feel the time of the day and the mood and things like that. All right, guys. Well, that is about it. So yeah, I'll make that discussion for kind of the urban sketching assignment. Go ahead and do that. I'll have it due Friday, so you'll have a few days to do it at when you have a chance. But each drawing, it should be about not too big. I'd say 5 to 7 inches wide. And each one should take you like, about 20 to 30 minutes. on that. And I encourage you guys to draw directly with pen. So I know that can be a challenge because you can't erase, but I don't want you guys to worry about, you know, erasing and getting the perfect drawing. For this urban sketching assignment, the goal to be a successful drawing is to just be a finished drawing, okay? So finish that, fill up an entire composition, think about light and shadow, think about perspective and all the things we've been practicing, but kind of from observation of something near you, neighborhood, park, street, wherever you are living. Any questions on anything before we sign off?
Yeah, so when we were talking about character silhouette last time, I'm kind of confused how you make them stand out in that kind of manner. If you just have like let's say you just have like a character who's like kind of like a normal kid, there's not very much that's very crazy, you know, to where you could, you know, like obviously recognize. I don't know. I'm kind of confused how to do that still.
So just kind of like a normal kid. So think about hair. Hair is a really good way to show that. From just what type of hairstyle is the kid going to wear, and design a hairstyle that breaks up our simple oval head. Okay?
Yeah.
So just with that simple oval head, you can get, you know, do they always wear a big bun on their head? Do they have a flowing ponytail behind there? Is it a little boy with like spiky hair? So the hair, that's kind of a good way to start. Also just think about what sort of accessories may they, you know, carry around with them for a specific scene in your story, or do they have hobby interests? Are they always carrying around, you know, their favorite bag, whatever it may be? Always carrying around. Do they always have their dog with them to help with that silhouette shape?
What about like if it was two characters, you know, would that help even to find the other? If one is, you know, if one's really, you know, like one's really obvious and the another one just more normal.
Yeah, that could help too. So yeah, one just kind of using standard everyday shapes, and one that gets a little bit more weird with stuff breaking up the silhouette.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wasn't sure if we were supposed to make them like really obvious with the silhouette. I was like, wait, what?
As long as if there's two, as long as they're different from each other, that will be one of the main goals also.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But you don't want, two characters that both look very normal. So this is Jack and this is Billy. I can't tell the difference between Jack and Billy. So you're gonna have to give one of them a hat, one of them spiky hair, one of them's always wearing a backpack, one of them's wearing different shaped clothes, maybe a big baggy hoodie and tight pants, whatever it may be.
Oh yeah, I have a human and a cat, so that'll work.
Okay, nice. Yeah, there you go.
And then one more. Hang on a sec. Oh yeah. So if we have like kind of like background characters, like I have like a couple like villains that are in the story, but you can't really see them that well because I mean it's kind of an over the shoulder shot, but they're kind of more in the dark. And so do I still need to like completely design them and obviously still stick them in the lineup?
Are you doing a comic or
Yeah.
So it may just be for a panel or two? Or just like the panels?
The last scene is like two characters breaking in and they're like have an illegal thing going and they're trying to arrest them kind of.
I would say at least just, you don't have to do as a detailed character sketch of them, but at least do just one where you're kind of figuring out that silhouette of whatever they may look like.
Okay.
But you don't need to include like all the details on there, especially if it's only going to be in one panel or one shot.
Yeah.
Just have.
Do you still want me like do you still want us like putting them all in the lineup and obviously making them look somewhat detailed, like you know what they look like.
Yeah, so maybe you have more details on your two main characters than you have, you know, our weird villain character, but you kind of just draw them as a silhouette and figure out kind of their size relationship to the characters. That'll be enough.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, then these two guys can have more of the details, the storytelling details, little stuff on them. But
Okay.
if you want to keep this just as a silhouette, that should be fine.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Anyone else have any questions before we go? All right. Yeah. So start thinking about that final project. Let me know if you guys have any questions before next class. I'll email you when I make the discussion for our urban sketching assignment, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.
All right, thank you.
See ya.
Bye.